relations between Ukraine and Russia have been strained. Since the collapse of Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine was known as the breadbasket of Soviet Russia and has remained a politically, militarily, and economically important to Russia ever since precisely. Why there is a dispute over sovereignty or otherwise of Ukraine is a complex question. Rooted into region's history, it's a story more than 1,000 years in the making. Sovereign state, so the name Ukraine will be used here to help identify. The region around Kiev, the Waso central to the story of Crimea, is an important part of the story too, and its history. Forms part of the history of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Applause today Kiev is the capital city of Ukraine millennium ago. It was the heart of foot, is known as the Kievan Rus state bet. Wien. The 8th and 11th centuries Norse traders sailed the river routes from the Baltic to the Black Sea predominantly. Swedish in origin, they found their way to the Byzantine Empire and even attacked Persia from the Caspian Sea in the 10th century around what is now Kiev. These traders begin to settle were referred to as the Rus, which seems to have its origins in the word for men who row, since they were so closely associated with the rivers and their ships merging with Slavic, Baltic, and Finnic tribes, they became known as the Kievan Rus. Applause. The Rus tribes are the ancestors Aftos who still bear their name. Today's Russian and Belarusian people, as well as those of Ukraine, Naki was referred to. By the 12th century, the mother of Rus city, effectively denoting it as the capital of the Kievan Rus state. Rulers of the region were princes of Kiev's association of Kiev with the early heritage of the Rus as the root of the Russian people, mean the city has a hold over the collective imaginations of those beyond modern Ukraine. It was important to the birth of Russia, but now lies beyond its borders. 1,000-year-old connection is the beginning of an explanation, oft present. Tensions. People are always willing to fight over places that exert a pull on them. Applause. In 1223, the irresistible expansion oft Mongol horde reached the Kievan Rus station, the 31st of May, the Battle of Thekakolka. River was fought, resulting in a decisive Mongol victory. The horde left the region after the battle. The damage had been done, and they would return in 1237 to complete conquering of Kievan Rus. Began the breakup of the Rus states and left the region under the dominion of the Golden Horde in some places for centuries. It was during this period that the Grand Duchy of Moscow began to rise, eventually booming the heart of what is now Russia, providing a new focal point for the Rus people. As the control of the Golden Horde slipped, Ukraine was absorbed into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and then the Plousht Lithuanian Commonwealth for a time. Music Cossacks, who were most closely linked with Kiev and Ukraine, began to resist the control of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and rebelled in favor of joining Rishonder, the Grand Princes of Moscow, since 1371. Russia had been slowly forming from disparates to test. The process was completed in the 1520s under Vasily III. Russian state appealed to the Rus peoples of Ukraine and exerted a pull on their allegiance in 1654. The Cossacks signed the Treaty of Pereyaslav with Tsar Alexis II, Tsar of the Romanov dynasty. This saw the Cossacks break with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and formally offer their allegiance to Thorosian Tsar would later style this as an act that reunified Ukraine with Russia, bringing all of the Rus people together under as our Crimea, which had been a Khanate, had been part of the Ottoman Empire, but following war between the Ottoman and Russian empires, Crimea had been briefly independent before being annexed by Russia on the orders of Catherine Thegretin, 1783, a move that was not resisted by the Tartars of the Crimea and which was recognized formally by the Ottoman Empire. During the 19th century, a Ukrainian identity began to emerge, more fully closely linked to the region's Kosakhertabi. This stage, Russians considered Ukrainians as well as Belarusians, ethnically Russian, but referred to both groups as Little Russians. In 1804, the growing separatist movement Ukraine led to a ban on teaching Ukrainian language in schools and aimed to eradicate the threat of a breakup of the Russian Empire from October 1853 to February 1, 1856. Teresian was rocked by the Crimean War. The Russian Empire fought a coalition off the Ottoman Empire. France and the United Kingdom in conflict saw the battles of Alma and Balaclava, the charge of the Light Brigade, and Florence Nightingale's experience that led to the professionalisation of nursing beaver being resolved by the siege off Sevastopol, a critically important naval base on the Black Sea. The Russian Empire lost the Crimean Warrant. The Treaty of Paris, signed on the 30th of March, 1856, saw Russia forbidden from basing naval forces in the Black Sea. The embarrassment felt by the Russian Empire led to internal reforms and modernization in an effort not to be left behind are the European powers. Ukraine remained unsettled too, and in 1876 the ban on teaching the Ukrainian language put in place in 1804 was extended to prohibit the publication or importation of books, performances off place, and the delivery of lectures in the Ukrainian language. In 1917, in the wake of the Russian Revolution, Ukraine was briefly an independent nation, but was soon to become part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics USSR. That would be a dominant for sane world politics for most of the rest of the 20th century was about to be born. Applause in 1922. Russia and Ukraine were two of the signatories to the founding document, the USRIT. Its wide sweeping fertile plains, it would become known as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, providing grain and food that made it an invaluable part of the U.S. fact only made what happened next all the more shocking. Holodomor was a state sponsor Edfoman, created by Stalin's government in the Ukraine as an act of genocide of crops, were seized and sold to overseas marks to fund Stalin's plans. Animals, including pets, were removed. Soviet soldiers ensured whatever remained is kept from the population, risking in the deliberate starvation and deaths of up to 4 million. The Second World War, Germany invaded Ukraine, moving across the border on the 22nd of June, 1941, and completing their takeover by November. 4 million Ukrainians were evacuated as Nazis encouraged collaboration by appearing to back an independent Trianian state, only to renege on that promise once in control. Between 1941 and 1944, around 1.5 million Jews living in Ukraine were killed by Nazi force. After the USSR was victorious at the Battle of Stalingrad in early 1943, the counteroffensive moved across Ukraine, raiding Kiev. In November that year, the fight for western Ukraine was hardened bloody until Nazi Germany was driven out altogether by the end of October 1944. Ukraine lost between 5 and 7 million lives during World War I. Famine in 1946-7 claimed around 1 million more lives. On pre-war levels of food production would not be restored until the 1960s. In 1954, the USSR transferred control of Crimea to Soviet Ukraine. There was perhaps a feeling that with USSR strong, it made little difference. Soviets did administered the territory, but the move stored up problems for a future in which Soviet Union no longer existed. The 26th of April, 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster took place in Yukondring. A test procedure on reactor number for a power decrease made their reactor unstable. The core went into meltdown. The subsequent explosion. The building Chernobyl remains one of only 2 nuclear disasters to be rated at the highest level, alongside the 2011 Fukushima disaster. The explosion at Chernobyl caused ongoing health issues for the surrounding area, and the Chernobyl exclusion zone covered more than 2,500 square kilometers. Chernobyl has been pointed to as one of the contributing causes of the collapse of the U.S. rate shook faith in the Soviet government. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Secretary General of the Soviet Union, said it was a turning point that opened the possibility of much greater freedom of expression, to the point that the system, as we knew it, could no longer continue. Applause. 5 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Ukraine was one of the signatories of document disbanding the Union, which meant that it was, at least on the surface, being recognized as an independent state. The same year, a referendum and election were held. The referendum question was, do you support an active declaration of independence of Ukraine? Over 84% of the population took part, almost 32 million people voting, 92.3% in favor of an independent Ukrainian. The presidential election, 6 candidates ran, all backing the Yes campaign. Leonid Kravchuk was elected the first president of Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ukraine became the third largest holder of nuclear weapons in the world. Although it possessed the warheads and the capacity to make more, the software that controlled them was in Russian hands. Russia and Western states agreed to recognize and respect Ukraine's independent sovereign status in return for handing most of its nuclear capacity over to Russia in 1994. The Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances provided for the destruction of the remaining warheads. Applause music. In 2004, the Orange Revolution took place mid protests about a corrupt residential election protests in Kiev and general strikes across the country. Eventually saw the election result overturned and Viktoria Yanukovych was replaced by Victoria Shenkith. Kiev Appellate Court gave a decision on the 13th of January 2010 that posthumously convicted Stalin, Gonovich, Molotov, and Ukrainian leaders Kozyr and Chuber, as well as others, of genocide against the Ukrainian people during the Holodomor of the 1930s. The decision served to reinforce a sense of Ukrainian identity and distance the country further from Russia. 2014 saw a great deal of unrest in Ukraine. The Revolution of Dignity, also known as the Maidan Revolution, erupted as a result of President Yanukovych's refusal to sign a document that would create a political association and free trade agreement with the EU. 130 people were killed, including 18 police officers, and the revolution led to early presidential elections in the same year. A pro-Russian uprising in eastern Ukraine, which Russia is suspected of sponsoring and which has been termed as an invasion, saw fighting begin in the Donbass region, which continues at present. The move served to solidify the sense of Ukrainian national identity and independence from Moscow. Also in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, which had been part of Ukraine since 1954. The reasons for this are complex. Crimea remains militarily and strategically important, with ports on the Black Sea, also a place regarded with fondness dating back to the Soviet era, when it was a holiday destination. Toddy Russia remains in control off Crimea, but that control is not recognized by the international community. Applause. Ukraine remains in a state of unrest that dates back to 2014. It was exacerbated in 2019 by a change to the constitution of Ukraine that enshrined closer links with both NATO and the youth. Step confirmed Russian fears about the influence of the US and Western European states on its borders, increasing tensions in the region. In the 1st of July 2021, the law was changed in Ukraine to allow the sale of farmland for the first time in 20 years. Original ban had been put in place to prevent the same sort of takeover by an oligarchy that Russia had seen in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. For Ukraine and Ukrainians, it created a huge opportunity to fill a gap in global food supply chains caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The beginning of 2022, Ukraine was the biggest exporter of sunflower oil in the world, the fourth largest shipper of corn, delivering grain to countries from Morocco to Bangladesh and Indonesia. Corn yields were a third lower than the U.S. and a quarter below EU levels, leaving room for improvement. Rich Gulf states were showing particular errors in supplies. Food from Ukraine of this meant that the former breadbasket of the Soviet Union saw its stock rise sharply, bringing with it unwelcome consequences. Applause. The relationship between Russia and Ukraine has always been complex and rooted in an often shared history. Russia has long viewed Ukraine as a Russian province, rather than a sovereign state. To counterbalance this perceived attack in its independence, Ukraine has sought closer ties with the West, both with NATO and the EU, which Russia in turn viewed as a threat to its own security. Beyond a shared heritage, a sentimental connectivity to the Rus states that centered on Kiev, Ukraine remains important to Russia. It's been a buffer between Russia and Western states, and fears that it will join NATO and the EU are perceived as a threat to Russia as a country with an economy based on food production, which it remains economically as well as strategically important. Russia's concerns about who is in control of Ukraine often leave little room in its thinking for an independence. To some extent, Ukraine in 2022 became to Russia what Cuba was to the U.S. in the 1960s. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 saw global nuclear war narrowly averted sustainable. Long-term solution to thorough relationship between Ukraine and Russia that all parties can live with may be hard to find, but it's required to avoid a repeat. Off the worst aspects of 20th century history, out the history hit YouTube where can get great exclusive videos and a sneak peek at what's available on Through World's Best History. Channel History Hit, it's growing really fast. We're thrilled too. Have you all aboard?